Well, good morning. That's the real start to the presentation.
Yes.
Thank you for coming this morning. Boy, this is really a challenge. We're 2 hours out of docking. So we're going to get to the moon and back and have you in plenty of time to get ready to go off the ship and enjoy yourself today. For those of you who have been here before, welcome back. For those of you who may be here for the first time, my name is Ken Stein, and we're going to take a journey to the moon today with Project Apollo. So sit back, relax, and let's go from a time when we thought we might be able to a time when we actually did. And if you remember, we had a program timeline last time, and we showed that these programs really ran concurrently. We would never have gotten to the moon in a decade if they had one after another. So we're going to pick it up right there in January 1967. But what had happened in all of that other time before that? Well, we had Mercury and Gemini, and we proved all of these things that we needed to go to the moon with. Remember, Gemini was that intermediate step that had to prove the rendezvous and the long duration, and controlling the spacecraft, and precise landings, and all the program facilities. The Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, which became Cape Kennedy Air Force Station, which became Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, and the Kennedy Space Station itself, and the Johnson Space Center. All of these things had been developed while we were looking at Gemini, the Saturn family, the command module, the lunar and surface modules, the lunar surface spacesuits, the launch process, methodology, and facilities, all the things that we talked about before. But we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about the Saturn V. We've talked about the capsules and a couple of rockets. Saturn V was critical to this success, the largest rocket at that time. Came from a lot of different places. A lot of people think the first stage came from Boeing outside of New Orleans, but actually that was the rocket test. It was too big to test where they manufactured it on the West Coast. So the first stage of the Saturn V rocket was tested outside of New Orleans, Louisiana. The second stage came from Seal Beach, North American Rockwell. Third stage from Douglas in Sacramento. The lunar lander, which was stored inside the Saturn IVB, came from Grumman in New York, and North American and Downey did the command and service modules. All in all, there was something like 12,000 suppliers and over 400,000 people working on this Apollo program, the whole thing. In other words, NASA had employment in every congressional district in the United States. A very smart move. But that's what the Saturn V, those are all the different pieces. We'll look at that in more detail. But we come to Apollo 1, we're talking January 1967 and the tragedy of Apollo 1. A deadly fire occurred while they were doing what's known as a plugs-out test. A plugs-out test is where the aircraft is not fueled, but it is running under its own power and it is pressurized as if it was in space. What they found was, as a result of that fire and the loss of the 3 astronauts, they were using 100% pressurized oxygen, which was highly flammable. It was all full of flammable material throughout the spacecraft inside the cockpit. Poor workmanship due to time constraints and time pressure was pushing them on, made an accident almost inevitable. The program was set back 20 months. They had over 1,000 changes in the redesign in the capsule, the service module, and the whole program, the program management, and the safety. And what they found, the problem here, one of the problems here in getting the astronauts out was the Block 1 hatch. There were actually 3 hatches, 2 opened outward, 1 opened inward. And the inward opening hatch could not be operated if there was more than 1 atmosphere pressure or 14.7 pounds of pressure, which is what we live under. You're at sea level right now, that's your ambient pressure right here. Well, they couldn't open it. Once the fire started, the pressure went up inside the capsule. They could never open it at all. Ironically, a new hatch was under design that was much easier to open and opened outward. But it was not being done for safety, it was being done for ease of spacewalks and exiting upon landing. But all of that was incorporated in the new command module. Now if you remember in Gemini, we had Gemini 6, where there was a change in the mission profile and it became Gemini 6 Alpha. And then we had Gemini 9 where there was a change and it became Gemini 9 Alpha. That's the U.S. system. but there will never be an Apollo 1 Alpha. The name was retired at the request of the family. So obviously now there's no Apollo program, but there was never any plans or anything for an Apollo 1A. Well, while the program was set back, we could not stop flying and developing based upon the timeline. So while the redesign was going on, the 20 months we talked about, they started to do unmanned tests. The first thing, they did a test flight of the Saturn V to see if it would work. A new test the command module, utilizing the command service module. I said utilizing the old command modules that they had already built that were no longer man-rated. The new ones were being designed and built. And test the heat shield. Here comes the third science portion I've warned about. Remember, the re-entry speed for going into orbit was, or the speed for insertion into orbit was what? 17,500 miles an hour. Well, when you go to the moon and back, you go faster. And the returning speed from a translunar insertion is 24,500 miles an hour, or about 7,000 miles an hour faster than to just orbit the Earth. And so you've got a heavier vehicle, 3 people, heavier, larger vehicle, traveling much faster, so you need a new heat shield. And so this was a test of that new heat shield. And they could not re-enter as they did during orbit, where they just fire the retro rockets and come down. They were going so fast and so big that the heat they generated, they'd come into the Earth orbit, come into the atmosphere, and then when they got so hot, they'd lift back up and cool off a little bit, and then they'd come down and come back up. They'd sort of skip in until they got slow enough where they could actually descend. So that was the new method of re-entering the atmosphere at that high speed. Apollo 5 was used to man-rate the lunar module and also to test the ascent and descent engines in the lunar module. Now remember, there were no men in it. This was an automatic test, but it was used to man-rate it. And Apollo 6 was to man-rate the Saturn V and also to check the direct return engine on the service module. So if they're going to the moon, they decide they don't want to go, they can turn around and use that service module engine that comes right back. We'll look at that here in a moment. None of these were manned missions. They were all automatic tests of various components, redesigned components, new components to going to the moon. We talked about the Apollo spacecraft. Here it is. It has the service module over here on the left, right up to this point. This is where you have all your consumables, your fuel cells, oxygen, water, your electrical power comes from. You have these thrusters here to make adjustments as you go, and this is the engine we just talked about that they can use to make in-course corrections and possibly turn around and come back if they had to. Then we have the command module. This is where the astronauts live and work. The only portion that returns to the Earth, if you will, and when you put them together, the service module and the command module, it's called the command service module. And I'll tell you, the originality of NASA is great. On the right-hand side, we have the lunar module. It consists of 2 pieces. You have the entire thing, then you have your descent stage and your ascent stage. After it lands with the descent stage, when it's time to come back, all that comes back is the ascent stage. It docks. The astronauts go back into the command module, which has been orbiting the moon. Remember, we talked about lunar rendezvous as the selected method last time, back in 1962, as to how they were going to do it, when we were talking about Gemini. And then this portion here, the ascent module, is sent back to crash on the moon surface, so that the seismographs that they have planted from their mission can start recording the geology of the moon. That's what it looks like. This is what it looks like inside the Saturn V during takeoff. There's the command module. There's the service module. And in the S4B is the lunar module stored for extraction by rendezvous and docking in orbit. And of course, that's the escape tower. Right, so here's what it looks like, some pictures. That's up in the upper left-hand corner is the lunar module stored inside that Saturn 4B. In the upper right-hand corner is the command service module. And right here, you see that little pin that goes in that little hole, and they extract it. The booster continues on towards the sun, and this is what it looks like basically joined together. This is called a stand-up EVA, where they just open the hatch and stand up. And he's looking up. This is the lunar module here. Somebody in the lunar module is taking his picture while he's taking a picture up. And this is the lunar module in the lower right corner in full flight. That's what it looks like. That's what goes down to the surface of the moon. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about Apollo going to the moon. These are the spacecraft, the rocket, the spacecraft, the various elements that make it up. Well, we know about the astronauts, but there were some heroes in the ground, in ground operations, well known within the community, if you will, of the astronauts in spaceflight. And one of the best known was Gunther Wendt. Gunther Wendt was at the Kennedy Space Center. He was the pad leader for all of the Mercury, Gemini, and manned Apollo launches. And he was the pad leader for all of Mercury and Gemini. When Gemini ended, and there was a contract renegotiation, North American Rockwell won the contract for pad operations, for launch pad operations. Gunther, who worked for McDonnell Aircraft, was therefore taken off the pad. Well, the astronauts considered him sort of a good luck charm, especially Wally Schirra. And Wally Schirra went to NASA and the contractors and said, this is not going to work. They brought pressure to bear, and McDonnell Douglas let Gunther go, and North American Rockwell hired him, and he went back to being the pad leader when North American Rockwell for all of the Apollo manned launches. A very famous guy, many young engineers who went on to his pad. He's the last person to touch the astronauts, buckle them in their seats, and then give the okay to mission control that they're ready to launch as far as the pad operations are concerned. And many a young engineer went to the launch complex with brilliant ideas and found out who really ran the pad. Gunther Wendt was famous for sayings like, I see no reason why we should have a problem here as long as we do it my way. And there's Wally Schirra in Apollo 7 with Gunther after he'd been sent, rehired by Rockwell and made the pad leader there. And here he is with Apollo 11. Very well known, very well respected individual down at the Space Center. So there are a lot of people who played very integral parts that never made it to the cover of Life magazine. Well, Apollo 7 was the first manned launch of the Apollo program in October of 1968. The first time the U.S. had launched a three-man capsule. They were the first ones to launch a manned Saturn 1B. You hear a lot of different names for the Saturn rocket, and the reason is the only time you needed a Saturn V is when you were going to the moon. Otherwise, it's way too big to go to low Earth orbit, unless you were doing some kind of a test. So you would take that out, and it became a different name Saturn. It became a Saturn 1B. And the third stage was the Saturn 4B. So you hear all different kinds of names. It depends on the configuration of the rocket and where it was going. But they're all parts of the Saturn. They tested the new command module and service module. You can see up here in their patch, there they are flying around testing that. And they were the last manned flight from, at that time, 1968, Cape Kennedy Air Force Station. Remember that naming convention? From 63 to 73, Cape Canaveral Air Force Station was Cape Kennedy Air Force Station. And they were the first to do a televised broadcast direct from space. Now some of you are going to say, wait a second, what about Gordon Cooper back in Mercury? He televised, but he televised slow scan TV down to mission control, and they had to clean it up and rebroadcast. This was the first direct, right out to commercial broadcast TV. A 10-day mission brought us to Apollo 8. Now the story of Apollo 8 is interesting. We're now in December of 1968. Apollo 8 was supposed to test the lunar lander in Earth orbit. Separate from the command service, extract it, separate from the command service module, fly around a bit, and bring it back to make sure all that stuff worked in Earth orbit. But the lunar lander was not ready. Everything else was ready, but not the lunar lander. They were wondering what to do until they got the word from intelligence sources that the Soviets were planning to do a circumnavigation of the moon. Either with dogs or people, they weren't sure, but they had received word that the Soviets were going to do a circumnavigation of the moon before the end of the year. Well, this was still the space race. And so a decision was made, since everything was ready, to send Apollo 8 to the moon. And they went to the moon. They were the first manned Saturn V launch of a full-up Saturn V. Remember, if they're going to the moon, you need a full-up Saturn V. First to leave Earth orbit, course, the first to go to the moon, circumvent the moon, the first people to see the dark side of the moon directly and come on back to Earth. Now, on their way back, Jim Lovell was doing some navigation work and he erased the navigation memory of the computer. Oops. And the capsule no longer knew where it was. And he had to manually, by doing star sightings, and they had contingency plans, by doing star sightings, they had markings on the window and stuff, to be able to reestablish the location and reprogram the computer and tell them where they were. Okay, all fixed. This was to have a little bit more importance about 16 months later. So keep that in mind. They were the ones that took the picture of Earthrise. They were the first to see the Earth as a planet, a whole planet. This picture of Earthrise was voted one of the 100 most significant pictures of the century by Life magazine. And I'm sure you NASA and their names are wearing their mission patches. Well, now we're going all the way to the moon. During deep space transit between the Earth and the moon, the spacecraft goes into barbecue mode. What is barbecue mode? Is it slowly rolling the spacecraft to distribute the sun's heat? Is it a coating that's periodically sprayed on the spacecraft exterior? Or C, a barbecue-like skewer that runs through the spacecraft for stability and weightlessness? What do you think? It is. It is A. They roll the spacecraft to distribute the sun's heat. Well, Apollo 9, launched in March of 1969, only 3 months after we had gone to the moon, was the first full-up flight of all of the requirements, all of the parts needed to go to the moon. It had everything that was needed. They went up, they took the lunar module, they extracted it, as I showed you earlier. You had your command service module and your lunar module like we saw as a unit. McDivitt and Schweikert were the first to move from one spacecraft to another when they moved from the command service module into the lunar lander. And then they separated. They went about 110 miles away from the command service module in Earth orbit, utilizing the descent engine. Then they separated from the descent portion, which went and burned up during re-entry into the atmosphere. And then they used the ascent engine of the lander to come back and redock and get back into the command service module. All of that worked out perfectly. They were also the first to test the new Apollo spacesuits. Remember, things were being developed at the same time. See it down here in the lower right. The significance of this was that American spacewalks up to this time used an umbilical cord that had their life support system. Soviets used the backpack. They were completely separated from the aircraft except by a line. The Americans, we started using an umbilical cord that had all their life support, their oxygen, their water, all that stuff in it. Now they had it on their backpack. The significance of this was they could move from one spacecraft to another. So should for some reason in lunar orbit they not be able to redock, the astronauts could still get back to the command service module to return to Earth. Or if they would have to get rescued or something. So that was a significant finding. There was one problem. Remember back when we talked about Gemini 3, the Molly Brown? Okay, Gus Grissom, when he named his capsule, remember the new rule? What was the new rule? No more naming of capsules. Well, NASA had a problem now. They had 2 spacecraft in orbit. The command service module and the lunar lander. So they rescinded that and they went back, they allowed them to start naming their capsules. And the first exciting names for the command service module and the lunar lander were Gumdrop and Spider. NASA asked that they start thinking of more sophisticated, meaningful names, and they said that's what they look like, so that's what they named them. And we'll see how this worked out over the naming process as it went along. So now we went back to naming spacecraft again. Apollo 10, everything was in place. Everything worked in Earth orbit, but would it work in the moon? Before we put men on the moon, would it work there? So the mission of Apollo 10 was to go there and do everything except land. And they went up, they did a full dress rehearsal for landing. They went into the lunar lander, they separated from the command service module, they went down within 8.5 miles of the surface of the moon. utilizing the descent engine, and then they let that go and use the ascent engine to go back up and rejoin the command service module. Everything worked. The command service module and the lunar module were Charlie Brown and Snoopy. They did this in order to try and maybe generate some interest among the kids, the youth of America. They named them Charlie Brown and Snoopy. Another thing they had to do was validate the gravitational field at low level of the moon for the landing computer of Apollo 11. That was one of their primary missions. Everything worked out fine. An 8-day mission. Remember we said the minimum time basically to go to the moon, put a lander down, come back was 8 days. That was the first thing they established in Gemini. 14 days was they figured would be the longest. And everything was great except Apollo 10 had everything the requirements to land on the moon. What did NASA do to make sure they didn't land by mistake? Was it not fully fueled? There's not enough fuel to land and take off again? The lunar landing engine was disabled, or the ascent engine start switch was removed? What do you think? Got an idea? They didn't have enough fuel. They were not fully fueled to land and then take off again and return up to the capsule, to the command service module. Well, now it's time for Apollo 11. Many of you probably remember it being launched in July of 1969. They had some firsts, but they had surprisingly few firsts because everything had been done before except the actual landing. And they landed like a rocket, which had never been done before. Remember old Flash Gordon, 1950s, that rocket coming down with a plane coming out? Well, that's what they did. They landed, the first rocket landed. They didn't have a lot of firsts, but they were really big firsts. But then during the descent, as they were coming down, you remember they got a 1202 alarm on their computer. They're coming down into landing on the moon, they get a 1202 alarm. What does that mean? What's going to happen? Well, let's step away from Apollo 11, leave them holding there, and go back to mission control. We haven't talked about mission control yet. Here you see 3 mission controls at different times. In the upper left-hand corner is the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station mission control during Mercury. Doesn't look very complicated, does it? Then if we move over to the upper right, you see the Houston mission control during Gemini, 1965. How many of you remember the rear projection overhead slides? Where you had an assistant sitting in the back, and you'd say, next slide, and the thing would change. Next slide, they were changing them manually. And then they'd get them upside down and sideways and backwards. And then they'd drop the stack, and they'd be all out of order. Okay, that's mission control during Gemini. And then in the bottom you see Houston mission control in 1969. If you look at the mission symbol up there, that's Apollo. That's what it looked like in 1969, a lot more complex. Now the people sitting, you have the flight director. The flight director is in charge. Failure's not an option. Gene Kranz, he's the flight director. Each one of the people in all those desks are called flight controllers, and they all have individual areas of responsibility in the mission. This one's responsible for this one. 1202 alarm. Apollo 11 lander is coming down, 1202 alarm on the computer. What does that mean? Well, flight director went to Guido. Guido is the guidance officer for an answer. Guidance officer was the name Steve Bales. Steve Bales was 26 years old. He pushed his intercom button and talked to the back room, his back room, and he talked to a guy by the name of Steve Cernan. Steve Cernan was 24 years old. Now this is not a time for discussion. The lander is heading for the moon. There's no discussion, there's no what's this, let's have a meeting. Steve and John Cernan talked about this for about 15 seconds and went back to flight and said, go flight. And there was no question. Flight turned to the Capcom, capsule communicator, which was an astronaut, to his left, and he said, go. And they gave him a go for continuing to land. 26 years old, 24 years old. This was a different time. And the trust between the flight controllers and the flight director and the astronauts is absolutely amazing. We'll talk some more about that. Well, we had the 1202 alarm. They're coming down. They got another 1202. continued to go, and Apollo continued, or the lunar lander continued down. Now, we know that Neil Armstrong maneuvered the lander away from the designated landing area and went to a place where it was safer to land. He had to maneuver away from there, and upon landing, he named it Tranquility Base. Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. Everybody remember that? You know, it's in our culture. Well, they didn't land where it was supposed to. The question is, did NASA know where Tranquility Base was? True or false? NASA knew where it was. True or false? Well, true. They did not know where it was. They had landed outside the box where they had designated, okay, you can land anywhere in here, we know about this. But they landed over here. Armstrong sent out, one of their tests was to send out a laser reflector, which they did, and NASA shot laser beams at it, never hit it. It wasn't until they had returned, now they got an idea while they were there within about 100 miles. But it wasn't until they returned and they looked at the descent and ascent films that they were actually able to pinpoint Tranquility Base, shoot a laser up there, and get a return from the reflector. So now we know exactly where it is. But while they were on the moon, they really didn't know where they were, within a large box. Well, talking about Tranquility Base, that's a pretty famous place. They landed there, July 24th. Everybody remember where they were? On July 20, when they landed on the moon? One of those events. I happened to have the privilege of being on a fire base in Vietnam. But we got to watch it. They flew in the television and ran up an antenna, and we got to watch it. They never went more than 160 feet away from the lander. They were only on the ground for about they only had an EVA of about 2.5 hours. 47 pounds of rocks. You can pick that up yourself. And they planted the flag about 25 feet from the lander, and when they took off, it blew up. It blew over. So, you know, that's one of those trivia questions. You've probably heard it. How many flags are flying on the moon? 5 are flying, 1's laying down. After this, the rule was you plant your flag more than 100 feet away from the lander, which they did with all the other ones and put it in a little deeper. Columbian Eagle, we know that. Well, as I said, Tranquility Base is a very famous place. So the question is Tranquility Base is a national park. Did the U.S. National Park Service declare it a national park? You ever got your gold card? How many of you have your park, your national park gold card? You know you can get in and out. Yeah. Can you get in there for free if you get there? Is it a national park? No, it's not. It's not because of the Outer Space Treaty prohibition. The United States is a signatory on the Outer Space Treaty, which everybody agrees to have no claims on extraterrestrial property. Now what's going to happen, they signed this a while ago when nobody was getting there. What's going to happen when people start to get to asteroids and the moon and Mars and other places like that in 30, 50 years, I don't know. But right now, no one is allowed, there'll be no colonization, nothing like we had in the world back in the 16 and 1700s. Well, that's true for the United States, but it is really a world event. Tranquility Base really represents the efforts of mankind. It went there for all mankind. So is Tranquility Base a UNESCO World Heritage Site? And for those who have always wondered, UNESCO stands for United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. So is Tranquility Base a UNESCO World Heritage Site? Seems logical, but it's not. Because to be a UNESCO site, the country claiming it has to have it within its borders. So, is it a historical landmark? Did it make that? Well, the answer is yes and no. For 48 states, it is not a historical landmark, but there are 2 states that say we can claim a historical landmark if our state had anything to do with it. And that's California and New Mexico. So in California and New Mexico, Tranquility Base is a historical landmark. That's it. Now the United States has requested that anybody who goes to the moon remain at least 100 meters away from Tranquility Base. But that's only a request. However, the International Astronomical Union, which names things on the moon, has named it Statio Tranquillitatis. That's it. There's the emblem for Apollo 11. Now originally, the olive branch was in the beak of the eagle and the talons were expended. But NASA felt that was a little too aggressive looking, so they moved it down into the feet so the talons were closed and going down. Very famous. The designation of the Apollo 11 patch is used on American currency. True or false? Look at your wallet. True. Eisenhower dollar and the Susan B. Anthony dollar. I know all you trivia people writing this down. We're going to get those next time. Okay, well, and of course, again, the people on the ground got certificates of participation in this event. So the people in mission control, in the launch pad, in the support agencies got this. This belongs to Jerry Pruitt, again, one of my wife's sorority sister's husbands, good friend of ours, and he was in on Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and some of the space station, and of course Skylab. Well, it brings us to Apollo 12, launched in November of 1969. Excuse me. Hit by lightning on takeoff, right after it cleared the tower, twice. It went dark entirely. They lost all their guidance, all their control. They were about to order a mission aboard when a guy by the name of John Aaron, the EECOM flight controller, that's electrical, environmental, and consumables controller, flight controller, sitting at a desk, remembered what they had done one time in a simulation, and he pushed his mic and said, "Flight, tell them aux switch A to B position, close this circuit breaker." Again, no question. Flight relayed that through Capcom up to them. We're talking seconds here. They threw the switch, pushed the button, and all of their stuff came back on, and they went to the moon. Absolutely amazing. Let's talk about that a little bit more. How do they do that? You've got your flight director, and you've got your flight controllers. They call that the pit, that area in front of the flight director. It's known also as the front room. Each flight controller sitting in the front room has a back room. It may or may not be located in Houston at Mission Control. But they have a back room who they are in hot communications with. And just like when we had the problem with the 1202 alarm, that flight controller can push his button on his intercom and talk to the back room where a bunch of experts in his system are sitting with all the diagrams and drawings and configurations. And behind them sits all the contractors out there who are sitting in their offices for the various parts of their mission. And at the same time, you have astronauts sitting in the flight simulator, the capsule simulator. And as the flight progresses and the astronaut goes over and throws this switch or turns this dial, they throw that switch or turn that dial. And for the experiments, there are scientists, the people who design these experiments are sitting there, and as the astronauts do things with the experiments, open something, close it, pour in, they're doing the same thing as much as they can replicate in gravity as opposed to weightlessness. So at any time that anything happens, they know exactly where all the switches are in the capsule. They know exactly where they are in the experiment. And there are literally thousands of people sitting there during this mission going along with it, ready to answer any question immediately or as quickly as they can. And you know, you've seen the movies where the astronauts are sitting in the simulator and have, well, at the same time they're sitting in the simulator, mission control is sitting at their consoles. They don't do anything independently. And while those astronauts are fighting with the problems that have been given them by the simulator training officer, they're going through mission control. And the mission control people are working with them to solve those problems. A tremendous backup. So when things like that happen, the answers are quick and correct. Tremendous trust between them. Whole big system going on to support those three gentlemen sitting in that capsule. So all that was going on, they fixed it, they went to the moon. Interesting, one of their primary missions was to go see Surveyor 3. There were no lunar rovers back then. They went to the moon, landed less than 600 feet from Surveyor 3. Amazing, isn't it? Slide rules. You know, no computer-generated imagery. Slide rules they did it with. There you can see there's the lander back there. There's Surveyor 3. An easy stroll. brought back 78 pounds, almost twice as much as 11 did, Yankee, Clipper, and Intrepid. Well, Apollo 13, probably one of the most famous missions that didn't get to the moon because of the movie and the fact of what they did. Hollywood took some license. Houston, we have a problem, is not what was said. What was said was, Houston, we've had a problem here. But the filmmakers felt that if you said had a problem, the audience would think it was over. So they changed it to have a problem. And it wasn't said by Lovell, it was said by Swiker. But since Tom Hanks was playing Jim Lovell and he was the star, he got to say it. But other than that, it was a successful failure. What happened in the service module, which had all the consumables, provided all the power, oxygen, and everything, there was an explosion in the number 2 tank caused by a short manufacturing defect months before. Rendered took all away all the power that they had in the command module. The only thing they had left was battery power. They had to use this battery power for re-entry. Remember, that command module is the only thing that comes back. So when it comes back, it's on battery power. And so they had to save that battery power. What were they going to do? Well, they made a lifeboat of the lunar lander, Aquarius, and they came back in Aquarius by going around the moon and slingshotting back. Now, why didn't they use the service module direct return motor that we talked about testing back in Apollo 6? Remember, the unmanned test? Well, they didn't know its status. Because of the explosion, they weren't sure that it would work. If they fired it, it may blow up, but if they did fire it and it worked, could they shut it off? So it was just too dangerous. It was too unknown to use. Now, the interesting thing about this was all of the things that happened on this mission had been simulated by one group or another. The loss of oxygen, the loss of electricity, using Aquarius as a lifeboat, the problems with the CO2 buildup, but it had never been simulated all together. The amount of problems was overwhelming. But because of their training and the way they do things, they managed to prioritize and fix the problems that they could fix in the right order without making things worse. And one of the most famous things they did was the carbon dioxide scrubber from the command module, which was square, and use it in the Aquarius system, which was round. And you probably many of you have heard of that. They had that problem, and they created what they called the scrubber, was called the mailbox, and that's the mailbox right there. That's what they put together to take the square CO2 scrubbers and use them in a round hole. Well, it came back. Odyssey and Aquarius, a very successful return. And we'll take a moment here while the program is pausing to see what happened to 13. NASA created many awards that they gave, and the astronauts said, we want an award. So they created what's called the Silver Snoopy. And the Silver Snoopy was designed by Charles Schultz, and he gave the copyright to NASA so they could reproduce it. And the Silver Snoopy is the Astronauts Award. The astronauts meet, they select people for the Astronauts Award for the Silver Snoopy for folks that achievements related to human flight and mission success. And then it's presented by an astronaut. So I'm receiving my Silver Snoopy here. That's Alan Poindexter. He's a 2-flight shuttle astronaut. Not at that time. This job usually goes to the rookies. Hate to tell you. But he is a 2-flight astronaut, 2-flight shuttle astronaut. And I have my Snoopy right here if you'd like to see after. It looks a lot bigger up there than it is right here. But if you'd like to see after, I'll be here and you can see what the Silver Snoopy looks like. That's an astronaut award by NASA. Well, this brings us to Apollo 14. It shows Apollo 14, if we look back here, we see that Apollo 13 was in April. Apollo 14 is in January, a really short period of time to fix problems. But it's one of the original Mercury 7 who went to the moon. And it was felt befitting that the return to flight from Apollo 13 would be led by Alan Shepard. Probably the most famous thing that happened on this was his golf swing, using a number 6 head on a lunar evacuation tool handle. He hit 2 golf balls on the moon. They collected 93 pounds of rocks. Remember, they originally counted 13, got 47 pounds. On the moon for EVAs in 9 hours, 3 times as much as the original Apollo 11. But the political climate was changing. Apollo 20 had been canceled, and its Saturn V had been designated over to Skylab. And then Apollo 18 and 19 were canceled, and their Saturn V's went to museums. So the political climate, the budget constraints, the cost of Vietnam, and other things going on. We've been to the moon, we beat the Soviets, they weren't going, public interest waned, and NASA realized that this was the closeout they were seeing of the Apollo program. So they made a change with Apollo 15. But first, Apollo 14 was famous for moon trees. That's true. What are moon trees? An unsuccessful or unpublicized attempt to grow trees on the moon, a catchphrase, or tree seeds carried by the astronauts for germination back on Earth. What do you think? That's right, it's seed. Tree seeds. And here you see, you can go on the web, Google moon trees, and it'll give you a list of where all the moon trees are that were grown from seeds flown on Apollo 14. This reads, if you can't read it, this sycamore tree was grown from a seed that traveled to the moon and back on Apollo 14, January 1971, presented to Camp Koch in 1976, rededicated in February 1997. Long live our moon tree. So there are moon trees out there. You can find them on the web where they are. Well, Apollo 15 was a change. They now went from trying to develop the technology to maintaining what they had and going to the moon for science. This is where we started the enhanced geology training for the astronauts. It was the first lunar rover, the first extended stay. You see they're up to 19 hours of EVA time. And then look at it's 170 pounds of rock.
Good morning, everyone. This is your cruise director, Carlos, and I wanted to highlight a few events and activities going on aboard the MS Amsterdam today, Wednesday, December 9th at 10 a.m.
Here I am. I'm back. Okay, with the lunar rover, one of the constraints of it was it never went further away than what it called a walk back. So the astronauts were always able to walk back to the lunar lander should the rover fail. Well, here you see, remember I said the enhanced training, this is where they went out in the field and started training. There's Scott from Apollo 15, Young and Duke from Apollo 16 out in Arizona and New Mexico, concentrating on the geology, on the science, more than the technology now. And because of their knowledge now, they found what's known as the Genesis rock. The Genesis rock is believed to be the oldest rock found in our solar system, over 4 billion years old. And within the circle is one of the most famous rocks brought back. No. Oh yeah, yes, they found it on the moon. I'm sorry, yes. They also left the fallen astronaut statue behind. It's a list of names of 8 U.S. and 6 cosmonauts who have died in the exploration of space, or as astronauts or cosmonauts. And there you can see the little statuette there. And that's on the moon left by Apollo 15. Apollo 16, 3 days on the lunar surface, over 20 hours going around on the moon. They were the first to climb a mountain that went 500 feet above the level of where the lander was. So these are big events. You know, it may not sound like much now, but these were big events back then. And Charlie Duke left a picture of his family. They named Casper and Orion, but they named the command module Casper, again, Casper the Friendly Ghost. Again, trying to get interest of the children. American interest was waning quite a bit at this time. And they even had a hard time getting national coverage for the broadcast from the modules from the moon. And during their lunar surface roving, the crew of Apollo 16 came across Big Muley. Big Muley was a crater that almost swallowed it, largest moon rock brought back, or a Soviet moon probe that was not known to have landed in the area. What do you think Big Muley was? The largest moon rock that brought back, named after Bill Muehlberger, who was the chief geologist on the Apollo program. Well, this brings us to Apollo 17, the last manned Saturn V launch. It was the first night launch and the first scientist astronaut. the first to have a civilian, non-pilot, non-military scientist on board. Now, Neil Armstrong was a civilian, but he was also a Navy man who had gotten out of the Navy and gone in via a NASA astronaut. There's no pilot training or anything. The first one, not the first civilian in space, not the first true civilian in space. That belonged to the Soviets. They had the first civilian in space. 248 pounds of moon rocks brought back. It shows you the increase in the capability over the time frame in the lunar lander's capability of the ascent module compared to 47 pounds for Apollo 11. 12 days, they had the longest lunar flight of over 12 days duration. They had the longest lunar EVA. As you can see, over 22 hours, they brought back the largest number of samples, and they spent the most time in lunar orbit around the moon. So a lot of firsts that nobody's going to beat for quite a while for the last mission to the moon. And that was in 1972. Well, one more for you. What material provided emergency repairs for the Apollo 17 lunar rover? Super glue, duct tape, or a spare battery? That duct tape fixes everything, and that's what it is. You can see it right here. They broke the fender, and lunar dust without gravity comes up and it just swirls around you. So they had to stop that from swirling around here. And this is a map held in place with duct tape. Got to have a roll. Well, commemorative plaque left on the leg of the lunar lander from Apollo 17. May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind. Now, we haven't been back, but we have been watching. This is in 2009. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter went around. That is Apollo 17's lander module. That's the lander portion down there. You can see the tracks from the rover. I see no alien footprints. No one has messed with it since we left it. This is where the 6 landings were on the near side of the moon, just to give you an idea. And with the program over, remember we had some stuff left over. So what we were going to do, well, we had Skylab and we had the Apollo Soyuz, which is the next chapter in the U.S. side. But we have been with the United States. We've gone to the moon with the United States. So next time we're going to go across the ocean, behind the Iron Curtain, and we're going to look at what the Soviets did in going to the moon and what they did after we got to the moon. All right, well, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank the crew. Otherwise, I'd be standing up here in the dark yelling at you. And I'll see you probably on the next day. I'll be in the back there to take any questions. Have a great day ashore. We'll see you then.